Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The coordinates didn't make sense. Sarah Brennan had double-checked them 3 times on the GPS unit, cross-referenced them with her topographic map, and even pulled out her compass for a manual bearing. The location where Tyler Chen's abandoned backpack had been found sat in a geological impossibility. A box canyon that, according to every survey conducted in the North Cascades since 1952, simply didn't exist. She stood at the trailhead of the Cascade Pass route, the October morning sharp and crystalline around her. At 32, Sarah had spent the better part of a decade studying the structural geology of the Pacific Northwest, first for her doctorate at the University of Washington, then for the USGS. She knew these mountains. She knew their bones, their ancient folding patterns, the way the North Cascades batholith had risen through the continental crust over millions of years. She knew what was possible and what wasn't. A box canyon in that location wasn't possible. Dr. Brennan? The park ranger, a weathered man named Mitchell who looked to be in his 50s, approached with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Thought you could use this. Going to be a long hike in. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the disposable cup. Tell me again about the person who found the backpack. Mitchell's expression darkened. Day hiker. Tourist from California, didn't know the area. Said he went off trail chasing what he thought was a dog. Realized later it was probably a coyote. Found the pack about 2 miles in, called it in immediately. Poor guy was pretty shaken up. Because of the backpack? Because of what was carved into the trees around it. Mitchell pulled out his phone, scrolled through photos, then handed it to her. Took these myself yesterday when I went to secure the scene. Sarah's scientific mind cataloged what she saw with uncomfortable precision. Deep gouges in the bark of ancient Douglas firs, each mark at least 8 feet off the ground. The patterns were deliberate, geometric almost, spirals within circles, lines radiating outward like corrupted suns, and symbols she didn't recognize, but that made her skin prickle with inexplicable unease. Could be wildlife, she offered, though she didn't believe it. The marks were too regular, too purposeful. That's what I told myself. Mitchell took his phone back. Until I saw the same markings a quarter mile in every direction from the pack. Perfect circle, all carved at the same height. All fresh, couldn't be more than a week old. Sarah sipped her coffee, buying time to think. She was here as a favor to the Chen family, who'd exhausted every official channel after their son disappeared 6 days ago. Tyler had been an undergraduate geology student at the University of Washington, bright and eager, the kind of kid who reminded Sarah why she'd gone into research in the first place. When he'd asked if he could do some field observations in the North Cascades for his senior thesis, she'd helped him plan the route, taught him proper safety protocols, made him promise to check in every night via satellite phone. He'd checked in for 3 nights. Then nothing. The search and rescue teams have been through the area? Sarah asked. Twice. Found nothing but the pack and those markings. Dogs lost the scent at the location. Just stopped tracking completely, like the trail ended. Mitchell paused. Look, I know you're here on your own time and I appreciate you coming out. The Chen family needed someone who knew their son, who could, I don't know, give them something the official reports couldn't. But I've been working these mountains for 23 years and there's something wrong about this one. Something that doesn't add up. Sarah wanted to tell him that everything added up if you had enough data, that the universe operated on rational principles, that mysteries were just problems waiting for sufficient information. Instead, she found herself looking at the wall of conifers that marked the beginning of the backcountry. Ancient trees that had been here centuries before the first European settlers, millennia before that. I'll be careful, she said. The hike in should have taken 4 hours. Sarah made it in 5, stopping frequently to mark waypoints on her GPS and take geological observations out of habit. The North Cascades in autumn were spectacular. golden larches blazing against the dark green of firs and spruce, the higher peaks already dusted with early snow. She'd hiked these mountains dozens of times, usually relishing the solitude, the way the modern world fell away once you got deep enough into the wilderness. Today, the solitude felt different, oppressive. She noticed it around hour 3, a subtle wrongness she couldn't quite articulate. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, small mammals rustling in undergrowth, the distant chatter of squirrels, had faded to near silence. Only the wind moved through the canopy, and even that sounded muted, as if the air itself had grown thick. The GPS coordinates led her off the established trail, down into a narrow valley she'd never explored despite her familiarity with the region. The terrain grew rougher, the forest darker as the canopy closed overhead. She had to pick her way carefully over fallen logs thick as cars, moss-covered and treacherous, remnants of trees that had been ancient when she was born. She found the first marking at 2:47 p.m., checking her watch automatically as her breath caught in her throat. The symbol was carved into a western red cedar, the bark peeled away in long strips to expose the pale wood beneath. Up close, she could see the marks weren't carved with any tool she recognized. No clean knife cuts or saw marks. The wood looked torn, as if something with immense strength had simply ripped through the bark and sapwood with raw force. The pattern matched the photos Mitchell had shown her. Spiral within spiral, radiating lines, and at the center, something that might have been a pictograph. Sarah pulled out her camera, documenting the marking from multiple angles, her hands steady despite the unease crawling up her spine. She found 11 more markers before she reached the location where Tyler's backpack had been recovered. Each one carved into a different tree, each one identical, each one positioned at exactly the same height, precisely 8 feet, 3 inches, she noted after measuring. The markers formed a perfect circle approximately half a mile in diameter, visible from the center point only if you knew where to look. The center point was wrong. Sarah stood in a small clearing, Tyler's blue and gray backpack lying where the ranger had left it after processing the scene, and felt the wrongness like a physical pressure. She pulled out her topographic map, spread it on a flat rock, and checked her GPS coordinates again. According to every map, every survey, every geological record, she was standing on the side of a gradually sloping ridge. There should be no clearing here, no flat ground. The terrain should continue upward for another 300 feet before plateauing. Instead, she stood in what could only be described as a natural amphitheater. The ground was level, roughly circular, perhaps 50 feet across. The trees around the perimeter were ancient, western red cedars that had to be 500-600 years old, their trunks massive, their branches creating a canopy so dense that very little light penetrated to the forest floor. And behind her, where the map insisted there should be continuing slope, was a rock face. Sarah approached it slowly, her geologist's eye automatically cataloging details. Metamorphic rock, heavily weathered, with an unusual crystalline structure she didn't immediately recognize. The face rose perhaps 40 feet, sheer and imposing. At its base, partially hidden by sword ferns and Oregon grape, was an opening, not a cave. Sarah had explored dozens of caves throughout the Cascades. This was something else. The opening was roughly rectangular, too regular to be natural, approximately 6 feet high and 4 feet wide. The edges showed what might have been tool marks, though so weathered and eroded that dating them would be impossible without proper equipment. She clicked on her headlamp, pulled out her flashlight as backup, and approached the opening. Every rational instinct she possessed screamed at her to mark the location, hike back out, return with proper equipment and backup. But Tyler's backpack lay 15 feet away, and the thought of his parents waiting for answers kept her moving forward. The passage beyond the opening was narrow, forcing her to turn sideways in places. The rock was cold beneath her gloved hands, and within 30 feet, all natural light had been swallowed by the darkness. Her headlamp beam seemed weaker than it should be, absorbed by the stone rather than reflected. The air smelled of mineral deposits and something else, something organic and unpleasant that made her breathe shallowly through her mouth. She'd gone perhaps 100 feet when the passage opened into a chamber. Sarah's light swept across a space that shouldn't exist. The chamber was enormous. She estimated at least 60 feet across, with a ceiling that rose beyond the reach of her light. The walls were covered in markings, not the same symbols she'd found on the trees. These were older, much older, carved or painted into the rock surface in pigments that had somehow survived centuries or perhaps millennia in this sealed environment. Pictographs depicting figures that were human and not human, animals that might have been deer or elk rendered in styles she recognized from Native American rock art, and everywhere recurring motifs, spirals, concentric circles, and a figure that appeared again and again, tall, impossibly thin, with branching appendages that could have been antlers or bare tree branches. Her archaeologist friends would lose their minds over this discovery. This was significant, potentially one of the most important indigenous sites in the Pacific Northwest. She needed to document everything, get experts in here, ensure the site was properly protected and studied. She was reaching for her camera when she saw Tyler's jacket. It lay crumpled against the far wall of the chamber, the bright red Gore-Tex unmistakable even in the dim light. Sarah's heart began to hammer as she crossed the space, her boots echoing on stone that felt somehow wrong beneath her feet. Too smooth, too regular, as if shaped by tools or forces she couldn't identify. Tyler? Her voice sounded strange in the chamber, muffled and distant. Tyler, can you hear me? The jacket was torn, she realized as she got closer. Not torn, shredded, as if something with claws had ripped through the expensive technical fabric. Dark stains covered the material, and Sarah didn't need lab analysis to know what they were. She picked up the jacket with trembling hands and something fell from the folds of fabric. A journal, Tyler's field notebook, which she recognized because she'd given him a stack of them before his trip. The same waterproof notebook she used for her own field observations. Sarah opened it with fingers that didn't feel entirely under her control. The first dozen pages were normal. Tyler's neat handwriting documenting geological observations, sketches of rock formations, notes about the glacial history of the valley. She recognized the sites he described, could trace his route through the backcountry from his entries. Then 4 days into his trip, the tone changed. Found something off the trail today. Cave system that's not on any maps. Went in about 50 feet before the passages split. Didn't want to go farther alone. But there's something about this place. Can't explain it. Feels old. Wrong. Going to come back tomorrow with better lights. The next entry, dated the following day. Went deeper today. Found the main chamber. Dr. Brennan needs to see this, it's incredible. Indigenous rock art everywhere, some of the oldest I've ever seen. But there's something else. The art depicts some kind of ritual or ceremony, and there are warnings. At least, that's what they feel like. Symbols repeated around what looks like a central figure. This thin humanoid shape with antlers or branches. There's a word carved near it, over and over. I don't know what language it is. Maybe Salish? Looks like Wetiko. Sarah's blood went cold. She knew that word, though Tyler had gotten the spelling slightly wrong. Wendigo, Wendigo, Wechuj. Different names in different languages, all describing the same thing. The Algonquian cannibal spirit, the creature of eternal hunger that possessed human beings and transformed them into monsters. If the tourist visiting this place brings chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Sarah's place? She flipped through more pages, Tyler's handwriting becoming increasingly erratic. Something's wrong. I've been hearing things. Sounds like twigs breaking, but it's inside the cave when I'm there. And outside when I'm at camp. Followed me today. I know it did. Caught glimpses of something moving between the trees. Too tall. Moving wrong. The marks on the trees. I thought they were territorial markings from a bear, but they're too high. And the pattern is deliberate. It's the same symbol from the cave, the spiral with the radiating lines. It's everywhere. I counted 12 so far, all in a circle around the cave entrance. I'm inside the circle. Can't sleep. When I close my eyes, I see it. The figure from the paintings. It's not art. It's a warning. They were trying to warn people to stay away. The spirals, I think they're meant to bind it or trap it or something. But some of the symbols are wrong now. Broken. Did I break them? Did I do this by coming here? The final entry, written in handwriting barely recognizable as Tyler's. It came to my tent last night. I heard it breathing. Smelled it, rotten old meat and something else, something like frozen earth. It spoke, not words. Just sounds that made pictures in my head. Pictures of hunger. It's so hungry. It wants to show me what hunger means. Real hunger. The kind that never ends. I'm going to try to run. If anyone finds this, don't follow me. Don't come looking. And whatever you do, don't speak to it. Don't listen. It gets inside you if you listen. The rest of the pages were blank. Sarah stood in the chamber, Tyler's journal in her hands, and felt the careful, rational framework of her worldview beginning to crack. There had to be an explanation. Environmental factors causing shared hallucinations. Ergot poisoning from contaminated food. Some kind of gas seeping from the rock that induced paranoid delusions. She was a scientist. There were always explanations. That's when she heard the breathing. It came from somewhere in the darkness beyond her light's reach, a sound like wind through dead trees, like the rasp of dry branches scraping together. But underneath it, unmistakably, was the rhythm of respiration. In, out, in, out. Tyler? Her voice cracked. Is someone there? The breathing stopped. Sarah's rational mind told her to leave. Mark the location, get out, call for backup with proper equipment and support. But she thought of Tyler's parents, waiting for news, hoping against hope that their son might still be alive. She thought of the dark stains on his jacket, the terror in his final journal entries, and she couldn't make herself turn away. She swept her light across the chamber, and in the far corner she saw another passage. This one sloped downward, into deeper darkness. The breathing had come from that direction. Sarah checked her watch. 4:17 p.m. She had maybe 3 hours of daylight left, less in these dense forests. If she was going to explore further, she needed to do it now and then get out before dark. She should have known better. Later, in the long, sleepless nights that followed, she would understand that this was the moment she could have turned back, could have saved herself. But in that moment, standing in the ancient chamber with Tyler's blood-stained jacket and his journal full of terror, she made the choice that damned her. She entered the descending passage. The tunnel narrowed and widened in irregular intervals, the rock formations unlike anything in her geological experience. In places, the walls looked almost organic, curved and flowing like melted wax. Her headlamp caught glints of crystalline structures embedded in the stone, minerals she couldn't identify reflecting her light in strange colors, deep purples and sick greens that hurt to look at directly. The smell grew stronger as she descended, not just decay, but something more complex and more wrong. It reminded her of a research trip to Alaska, visiting a site where ancient ice was melting, releasing organic matter that had been frozen for thousands of years. The smell of time itself, of things that should have stayed buried. The passage opened into a second chamber, smaller than the first but more disturbing. Here the walls were covered not with ancient pictographs, but with newer markings. Scratches, she realized with mounting horror. Thousands of scratch marks covering every surface gouged deep into the stone. In some places, the scratches formed words, or what might have been words, in languages she didn't recognize, and bones. They littered the floor of the chamber, scattered among the rocks and debris. Not fresh, most were old, weathered, some partially mineralized. Deer, she thought, identifying the long bones and skull fragments. Elk, mountain goats, other animals she couldn't immediately name, but also unmistakably human remains. Not many. Perhaps 3 or 4 individuals based on what she could see. Old enough that they were more fossil than corpse, the bones stained dark by minerals in the surrounding rock. Sarah's archaeological training warred with her revulsion as she documented the scene with her camera, taking photos she knew experts would need to see. She was photographing what appeared to be a human femur when she saw the footprint. fresh, so fresh that the disturbed dust around it hadn't settled yet. The print was large, perhaps 15 inches long, but the proportions were wrong. Too narrow in the heel, too wide at the toes, and the stride suggested something that walked on two legs, but not in any gait she recognized. Sarah's light followed the tracks across the chamber. They led to a third passage, even narrower than the previous ones, barely wide enough for her to fit through. She shouldn't follow them. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back. But she thought of Tyler's last entry. "I'm going to try to run." Had he come this deep? Was he somewhere in these passages, injured, waiting for help? The narrow passage seemed to close around her as she squeezed through, the rock pressing against her chest and back, her backpack scraping against the stone above. For a terrible moment she thought she was stuck, that she'd wedged herself into a space too small and would die here in the darkness, slowly suffocating beneath millions of tons of mountain. Then the passage opened, and she stumbled into a space so vast her light couldn't find its boundaries. Not a chamber, a cavern. The air was different here, colder, with a quality she couldn't define, as if it were somehow thicker than normal air. Her breath formed clouds that hung in the beam of her headlamp. But it wasn't cold enough for that. Couldn't be more than 50 degrees. Sarah walked forward slowly, her boots crunching on something that might have been gravel. The sound echoed strangely, as if the space absorbed and reflected it at the same time, creating layers of sound that disoriented her. Her light found a wall, and she saw what covered it. Pictographs, thousands of them covering every inch of the cavern walls rising up beyond the reach of her light. But these were different from the ones in the upper chamber. These were alive with movement, with narrative. She saw scenes of hunting, of gathering, of ceremonies she couldn't begin to interpret. And everywhere, dominating every surface, was the figure from Tyler's journal. The thin, antlered form, repeated endlessly in variations. Sometimes alone, sometimes surrounded by human figures, sometimes consuming them. In one sequence rendered in terrible detail, she saw what might have been the creature's origin story. Human figures performing a ritual. One figure separated from the others, placed in the center of a circle of spirals. The figure changing, transforming, becoming the antlered thing. And then the hunger. Scene after scene, showing the transformed figure consuming everything it encountered. Animals, humans, entire settlements depicted as empty circles of dwellings. And in the final scene, the capture. Warriors surrounding the creature, trapping it with symbols that matched the ones she'd seen on the trees outside. The symbols forming a circle, a prison. The creature trapped inside, bound by the spirals, held by the power of the markings. Held here. The understanding came to Sarah with a clarity that felt like ice water in her veins. This wasn't just a cave. It was a prison. The indigenous peoples who'd created these markings had trapped something here, sealed it away, and left warnings to ensure no one would break the seal. Warnings Tyler had ignored. Warnings she'd ignored. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was barely a whisper, but it filled the cavern, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Not Tyler's voice. Not any voice that had ever belonged to a human throat. Sarah spun, her light stabbing into the darkness, finding nothing. "Tyler, Tyler, is that you?" "Tyler is gone." The whisper wrapped around her, intimate as a lover's breath. "Tyler fed the hunger. Tyler is part of the hunger now." Her light found it then, and Sarah's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. It stood at the far edge of her light's reach, partially hidden by a pillar of stone. Tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet, thin to the point of emaciation, the silhouette suggesting bones beneath skin that was the color of old parchment stretched tight. Antlers rose from its skull, but they weren't the clean, symmetrical antlers of a deer or elk. These were twisted, broken things that looked like charred branches reaching toward the ceiling. And its face. Sarah made a sound that was half sob, half scream. Its face was human. Or had been human. Tyler's face, she realized with horror, that threatened to shatter her sanity. But stretched, distorted, the features pulled long and thin, the eyes too large and too dark, the mouth opening far wider than any human jaw should allow. revealing teeth that went back and back into impossible depths. "You see?" The thing that had been Tyler whispered with his voice, and something else layered underneath, something ancient and hungry beyond all comprehension. "You see what I've become?" Sarah's scientific training deserted her entirely. She ran. The cavern became a nightmare of passages and chambers, each one bleeding into the next. She had no idea which direction led out, couldn't remember the route she'd taken in. Her headlamp beam bounced wildly off rock surfaces, creating monstrous shadows that reached for her. Behind her, she heard movement, the scrape of something too large moving through spaces too small, the click of what might have been claws on stone, and underneath it all, that terrible breathing. She emerged into a chamber she didn't recognize, her lungs burning, and realized with fresh horror that she was lost. The passages had turned her around, or the thing had hurted her deeper. She pressed her back against a wall, trying to control her panic, trying to think. The breathing grew closer. She could smell it now, that odor of rot and frozen earth so strong it made her gag. "Why do you run?" The voice was closer, coming from a passage to her right. "You came looking for truth, for answers. Let me show you. Let me show you what hunger really means." "Stay away from me." Sarah's voice broke. "Tyler, if you're still in there, fight it. You're not. This isn't you." Laughter, dry and brittle as dead leaves. Tyler welcomed me. Tyler understood in the end. The hunger is truth. Everything else is illusion. All the things you value, love, compassion, rationality, all of it is just denial of the truth. We are hunger. We are emptiness that can never be filled. I am the truth of winter, of famine, of desperation. I am what you all become when everything else is stripped away. A shape detached from the shadows of the passage. Sarah's light found it, and she saw it fully now. The thing wore the tattered remains of Tyler's clothes, the fabric stretched and torn across a frame that had been twisted into something new. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in ways that made her eyes hurt. The antlers scraping against the stone ceiling weren't antlers at all, she realized. They were fingers. Human fingers elongated and branching, reaching out like the hungry roots of some parasitic plant. "I've been here so long," it whispered, and Sarah heard genuine anguish beneath the hunger. Centuries, millennia, bound by their symbols, trapped in their prison of spirals. But the symbols fade, the power weakens, and when your student came, when he crossed the threshold and spoke my name, the last bindings broke. He gave me a gift. He gave me a body that could leave this place. Tyler's dead. Sarah said it like a prayer, like a denial. You killed him. I transformed him, elevated him, showed him truth. The creature moved closer, each step deliberate. And now he hungers. We hunger. But one body is not enough. The hunger grows, you see. It always grows. That's the curse and the gift. I need more. Many more. An entire world is waiting out there, and I've been so patient, so very patient. Sarah's hand closed around a rock on the cavern floor. It wouldn't do any good against this thing, she knew, but holding it gave her something solid, something real in a nightmare that couldn't be real but was. "The symbols," she said, her mind racing. "The spirals. They bound you. They can bind you again." The creature's laugh was worse than its voice. "You think you understand. You think your science, your knowledge, means anything here? The symbols were created by people who believed, who knew the truth of the world beyond your pathetic rational framework. You don't believe. You can't. Your mind is too small, too trapped in its own illusions." But even as it spoke, Sarah saw something. In the wall behind the creature, carved deep into the stone, was one of the spiral symbols. And it was glowing. Faintly, barely visible, but definitely glowing with a soft blue light that seemed to cause the creature pain. It had positioned itself carefully to keep that section of wall behind it, not looking at it, as if the symbol's presence hurt even to acknowledge. Sarah understood then. The symbols weren't just art. They were something else, something that existed in the space between symbol and reality, between belief and truth. and belief mattered. "You're afraid," she said. "You're afraid of those symbols. That's why you needed Tyler to cross the threshold. Why you couldn't break free on your own. Because somewhere deep down, even you believe in them." The creature's face, Tyler's face, contorted with rage. "I believe in hunger. That's all there is. That's all there ever was." It lunged. Sarah threw herself sideways, rolling across the rough stone, feeling skin tear from her palms. She scrambled to her feet and ran again, but this time with purpose. She needed to get back to the upper chamber, to the opening, to the circle of symbols carved on the trees outside. If those symbols had held it for centuries, they might hold it still. The passages blurred together. She followed instinct more than memory, taking turns that felt right, squeezing through gaps that her rational mind insisted were too narrow. Behind her, the creature followed, no longer bothering with whispered threats. It wanted her too badly now to play games. She burst into the main chamber, the one with the ancient pictographs, and saw light, real light, not from her headlamp but from the entrance passage. Daylight, fading but still there. She'd been underground for hours. Must be close to sunset now, but there was still time to get out. The creature emerged from the passage behind her, moving with terrible speed despite its distorted frame. Sarah ran for the exit, feeling something grab at her backpack. She shrugged out of the straps, leaving it behind, and dove into the narrow passage that led to the outside world. She scraped through, rock tearing at her clothes and skin, barely feeling the pain in her desperation. And then she was out, stumbling into the clearing where this nightmare had begun, gulping air that tasted like freedom. But the creature was coming. She could hear it in the passage, forcing its transformed body through the narrow space, driven by hunger that could never be satisfied. Sarah ran to the nearest tree with the spiral symbol carved into its bark. She pressed her hand against it, feeling the rough wood, feeling the intentionality of the carving, the power that had been invested in it by people who believed. "Please," she whispered, not sure who or what she was praying to. "Please work. Please be real." The creature exploded from the cave entrance, its antler fingers reaching for her, its mouth open impossibly wide. Sarah saw herself reflected in its two large eyes, saw Tyler's face beneath the horror, saw the truth it wanted to show her, the emptiness, the hunger, the void at the center of everything. And then it stopped. It stood at the cave entrance, straining forward but unable to move past the threshold. Its twisted hands reached for her, fingers elongating, stretching across the impossible distance, but always stopping inches from her skin. The spiral symbols on the trees had begun to glow with that same soft blue light, faint in the dying daylight but unmistakable now that she was looking for it. "You can't leave," Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. "The circle is still intact. You're still trapped." The creature's face contorted through a dozen expressions: rage, hunger, despair, and beneath it all, something that might have been Tyler's fear. "This won't hold me. It's weaker than before. Every day it weakens more. I'll get out. I'll find you. I'll find everyone. Then I'll make sure no one else comes here." Sarah backed away slowly, not taking her eyes off the thing. "I'll make sure this place is marked, protected, that the symbols are maintained. You'll stay trapped until you fade back into whatever hell spawned you. You can't stop the hunger. It's already inside you. You've seen it now. You've looked into the truth and it's changed you. You'll carry me with you. In your dreams, in your quiet moments. You'll remember what I showed you, that everything you believe about the world, about yourself, is a lie. And someday when you're weak enough, when you've lost enough, I'll be waiting. We'll all be waiting." Sarah turned and ran. She ran through the darkening forest, following her GPS back to the trail, not looking back, not letting herself think about what she was leaving behind. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs trembled, ran until she emerged onto the established trail just as full darkness fell. Mitchell found her 2 hours later, guided by the signal from her emergency beacon. She'd activated it the moment she had signal, then collapsed on the trail, shaking with exhaustion and something deeper than exhaustion. Dr. Brennan, Jesus, we were about to launch a search. Are you hurt? Where's your gear? The ranger's voice seemed to come from very far away. Tyler Chen is dead, Sarah heard herself say. He's dead, but he's still down there. You need to close the area, make it off limits, and you need to maintain those symbols, the ones carved on the trees. They need to stay intact. Do you understand? They need to stay intact. Mitchell must have seen something in her face, heard something in her voice, because he didn't argue. He just helped her to her feet and guided her back to the trailhead, where an ambulance was waiting. They found Tyler's body 3 days later, after Sarah gave them detailed directions and refused to return to the site herself. The official report said he'd fallen and sustained fatal injuries, then crawled into the cave system where he died of exposure and trauma. They found her backpack beside him, which made sense in the official timeline. She'd gone looking for him, found his body, and fled in distress. No one mentioned the symbols. No one mentioned the pictographs. The site was quietly declared culturally sensitive and closed to public access, with regular patrols to ensure the closure was respected. Sarah made sure of that, calling in favors, pulling strings at the USGS and National Park Service, dedicating her career to making sure no one else would make her mistake. But the creature had been right about one thing. She couldn't forget. In her dreams, she returned to that cavern. In her quiet moments, she heard the whisper of its voice, felt the touch of its hunger. And sometimes on winter nights when the wind moved through bare trees with a sound like breathing, she wondered how much longer the symbols would hold. How much longer before something hungry and patient and utterly inhuman found a way to break free and show the world what truth really meant. She kept Tyler's journal, hidden in a safe in her apartment. She'd read it sometimes late at night, studying his descent into horror, looking for clues she'd missed, warning signs she should have seen. And on the last page, below his final entry, she found something she hadn't noticed before. Written in handwriting that might have been his or might have been something else, were 4 words in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. The hunger never ends. Sarah Brennan lived with that truth now. She carried it like a weight, like a responsibility. She became the guardian of a secret that rationality couldn't accept, but that she knew was real. Because she'd seen it. She'd looked into the face of something that shouldn't exist, and it had looked back into her. And she knew, with a certainty that went deeper than science or reason, that somewhere in the darkness beneath the North Cascades, something waited, something that wore Tyler Chen's face and spoke with his voice and dreamed of the day when the symbols would fade completely, when the prison would finally break, when the hunger could be satisfied. She knew it would be waiting for a very long time, but she also knew that time meant nothing to creatures like that. It had waited for centuries. It could wait for centuries more, and eventually, inevitably, something or someone would make a mistake, would cross the threshold, would speak the name, and the hunger would be free. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? The phone call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in February, and Christopher Hayes would later remember that he'd been watching the news with a glass of whiskey in his hand when his daughter's number flashed across the screen. He'd answered expecting the usual, Rachel asking for a ride home from her friend's house or maybe requesting permission to stay out late. Instead, what he heard made his blood turn to ice water. "Dad?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with something beyond fear. Something primal. "Dad, please. You have to. There's something wrong here. Something really wrong." Christopher sat up straight, whiskey forgotten. "Rachel, what's going on? Where are you?" "Isle Royale, the cabin. Dad, Sarah's parents, they're not here. They said they'd be here, but the cabin's been abandoned and there's..." Static crackled through the line. "Tracks in the snow. Huge tracks. And the trees, Dad. Someone carved things into the trees and oh God, there's something moving out there in the..." "Rachel, slow down. You're at Isle Royale? In Michigan? What the hell are you doing there in February?" Sarah wanted to surprise her parents for their anniversary. They were supposed to be at their cabin for the week, but Dad, they're not here. Nobody's here. And I think something happened to them because there's blood in the The line dissolved into static. Christopher pressed the phone harder against his ear, heart hammering. "Rachel! Rachel!" For a moment he heard only interference, and then her voice came back, lower now, urgent and terrified. "It's at the window. Dad, it's looking at me. Its eyes are... Oh Jesus Christ." "Rachel." A sound came through the phone then that Christopher would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. A wet, rattling breath that seemed to come from lungs too large, too empty, and beneath it a voice that might have been Rachel screaming. But the sound was swallowed by static and then nothing. The line went dead. Christopher tried calling back immediately. Nothing. Straight to voicemail. He tried 6 more times as he paced his living room, each attempt met with the same automated message. He called Sarah Mitchum's parents. No answer. He called Sarah's cell. No answer. He pulled up his laptop with shaking hands and searched for information about Isle Royale National Park. What he found made his stomach drop. The island was accessible only by seaplane or ferry, and in February, in the dead of winter, the ferry didn't run. The park was officially closed. Temperatures were well below freezing. The island sat in the middle of Lake Superior, nearly 15 miles from the nearest point of mainland Michigan. If something had happened to Rachel out there, if she was hurt or in danger, she was trapped on 45 miles of frozen wilderness with no easy way out. He called the Houghton County Sheriff's Department. The dispatcher listened to his story with professional calm and told him they'd send someone to check on the situation as soon as possible, but that weather conditions made immediate response difficult. A winter storm was moving across Lake Superior. It might be morning before they could get a boat or plane out there. "My daughter is in danger right now," Christopher said, voice tight with barely controlled panic. "She called me terrified. Someone needs to get out there tonight." "Sir, I understand your concern, but Isle Royale in February. There's no one on that island. The park's been closed since November. Your daughter must be mistaken about her location." "She's not mistaken. I know my daughter's voice. She said Isle Royale. She said the cabin. Please, you have to. We'll do what we can, sir. But realistically, we're looking at a first light response. I'm sorry." Christopher hung up and stood in his silent living room, mind racing. First light was 8 hours away. 8 hours while Rachel was alone on that island with something that had terrified her so badly she could barely speak. 8 hours while the temperature dropped and the storm rolled in. He thought of that breathing sound on the phone, that impossible wet rattle, and something deep in his gut told him that 8 hours might as well be forever. He grabbed his laptop again and started searching for charter services. Most were closed for the season, but he finally found a seaplane service in Houghton that listed an emergency contact number. A gruff voice answered after 5 rings. "Yeah?" "I need to charter a plane to Isle Royale, tonight, right now." A pause. "You serious?" "Completely. My daughter's stranded there. I'll pay whatever you want." "Buddy, there's a storm coming in. I'm not flying into Lake Superior in these conditions, and sure as hell not at night. You're talking about a suicide run." "Please. She's 16 years old and she's terrified. I'll sign any waiver you want. I'll pay triple your normal rate." Another long pause. Christopher could hear the man breathing, considering. "Quadruple. Cash. And you sign a waiver that says I'm not responsible if we end up in the lake. And we leave right now before the storm gets worse. We're not waiting for morning." "Done. Text me the address." 70 minutes later, Christopher was climbing into a battered Cessna 185 at a small airfield outside Houghton. The pilot, a weathered man in his 60s who'd introduced himself simply as Dutch, had barely looked at him while counting the cash Christopher had withdrawn from 3 different ATMs. The waiver had been thorough and terrifying, but Christopher had signed it without reading past the first paragraph. "Your funeral," Dutch had muttered, pocketing the money. "Literally might be if this weather turns on us." They took off into a night sky that seemed to press down like a physical weight. Christopher sat in the co-pilot's seat, hands gripping the edges, and watched the lights of Michigan's Upper Peninsula fall away beneath them. Within minutes they were over the black expanse of Lake Superior, and Christopher understood why Dutch had been reluctant. The water below was invisible except where moonlight caught the peaks of massive waves. Wind buffeted the small plane, and Dutch's hands never stopped making small corrections on the controls. "Your daughter," Dutch said after 20 minutes of tense silence. "She tell you which cabin she was at?" She said the cabin. Her friend Sarah's parents own property on the island. "Huh. Didn't know there were any private cabins left on Isle Royale. Park Service bought most of them out years ago. There's a few grandfathered in, I guess. Still seems weird for a kid to be out there in February. Sarah wanted to surprise her parents. They were supposed to be there for their anniversary." Dutch glanced at him. "Parents weren't there?" Rachel said the cabin was abandoned. "That's not good." Dutch returned his attention to the instruments. Isle Royale in winter. It's not a place you want to be alone, even without the weather, even without the wildlife. There's something about that island. The Ojibwe knew it. They'd visit for copper and fish, but they never stayed long. Never stayed through winter. They had stories about it. What kind of stories? Dutch was quiet for a moment, and Christopher thought he wouldn't answer. Then, hunger stories. Stories about what happens when people get too hungry, when winter goes on too long and the food runs out. Stories about things that used to be human but aren't anymore. Things that are always hungry, no matter how much they eat. He shook his head. Old legends. Probably just their way of explaining why people went crazy when they were starving. Wendigo, they called it. A spirit of endless hunger. The word sent a chill through Christopher that had nothing to do with the temperature in the unheated plane. He thought of Rachel's voice on the phone, the terror in it, the breathing sound. "You believe in that?" he asked. Dutch shrugged. "I believe that Isle Royale's a dangerous place in February. I believe that people die out there when they shouldn't be there. I believe that every few years someone goes missing on that island, and they don't find the body until spring if they find it at all." He adjusted their heading slightly. "I believe your daughter shouldn't be out there, and the sooner we get her off, the better." They flew in silence after that. Christopher watched the darkness below and tried not to think about what Rachel had said. There's something moving out there. He tried not to think about the breathing sound. He tried to focus on practical things. They'd land, they'd find Rachel and Sarah, they'd all fly back together. Simple, clean. But his mind kept circling back to that moment on the phone, to the raw animal terror in his daughter's voice. Isle Royale appeared as a darker shadow against the dark water, barely visible in the moonlight. Dutch circled once, looking for a place to land, and Christopher saw nothing but trees and snow and rocky shoreline. No lights, no signs of habitation. "Where's the cabin?" Dutch asked. "I don't know. Rachel didn't say." "Great." Dutch completed another circle, lower this time. "There's a few clearings on the northeast side that might work. We've got maybe one shot at this. I'm not going to have enough fuel to circle around looking for the perfect spot. You see anything that looks like a cabin?" Christopher pressed his face against the cold window, scanning the wilderness below. And then on their third pass he saw it, a small structure set back from the shoreline, barely visible through the trees. A thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney. "There," he pointed. "There's smoke. Someone's there." Dutch banked hard toward the location. "That's something at least. Okay, I see a clearing about a quarter-mile from the cabin. It's small, but it's the best we're going to get. Hold on to something." The landing was rough. The plane bounced twice on the snow-covered ground, skidded sideways, and came to a stop less than 20 feet from a stand of pine trees. Christopher had his seatbelt off before they'd fully stopped moving. "Wait!" Dutch grabbed his arm. "You got a weapon?" "What?" "No." Dutch reached behind his seat and pulled out a shotgun. "Take this, and take these." He handed over a flashlight and a handheld radio. "Channel 3. If something happens, if you need me to get out of here fast, you radio. I'll have the plane ready." "You're not coming with me?" "Someone needs to stay with the plane and keep the engine from freezing. Besides, I'm 73 years old and my knees are shot. You want to move fast? You go alone." He met Christopher's eyes. "But listen to me. If something feels wrong, I mean really wrong, you grab your daughter and you run back here. Don't try to understand it. Don't try to fight it. Just run. Understand?" Christopher took the shotgun, the flashlight, and the radio. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet, just come back alive." The cold hit Christopher like a physical blow when he stepped out of the plane. He'd dressed warmly for the flight, but this was different. This was Lake Superior in February, wind howling in from across miles of ice water, temperature well below zero. He zipped his jacket to his chin, pulled on his gloves, and started toward the cabin. The snow was deep, in some places up to his knees. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees that seemed to press in from all sides. Christopher had been camping before, had spent time in the woods, but this felt different. The silence was absolute, except for the crunch of his boots in the snow and the whistle of wind through the pines. No animal sounds, no birds, just silence and cold and darkness. The trees nearest the cabin came into view, and Christopher's step faltered. Dutch had been right about one thing. Someone had been carving into the bark. But these weren't the idle carvings of bored teenagers or the territorial markings of hunters. These were symbols, dozens of them, cut deep into the trees in rough circles around the cabin. Christopher didn't recognize the patterns, but something about them made his skin crawl. They looked old, weathered by years of exposure, but some of the cuts looked fresh, the wood beneath still pale and unscarred, and between the symbols there were markings in the snow. Tracks. Christopher had gone hunting with his father as a boy, had learned to identify deer and rabbit and bear prints. These were none of those. They were massive, easily twice the size of his own boot prints, but elongated and strange. The toes were too long, the stride too wide. Whatever had made them had been moving in a crouch, the tracks suggesting something that walked on two legs but shouldn't. Christopher's hands tightened on the shotgun. He approached the cabin slowly, every sense alert. The structure was small, maybe 30 feet on a side, built from logs that had gone gray with age. 2 windows flanked a solid wooden door. Smoke still rose from the chimney. Yellow light flickered behind one of the windows. Candlelight or a fire, nothing electric. He was 10 feet from the door when he heard a sound from inside. A soft thump, like something heavy being set down. Then silence. "Rachel?" His voice sounded too loud in the quiet. "Rachel, it's Dad. I'm here." Nothing. He tried the door. It opened easily, swinging inward on hinges that creaked in the silence. The interior of the cabin was dim, lit only by a fire burning low in a stone fireplace. The room was small, sparsely furnished. A table, 2 chairs, a couch against one wall. A door on the far side presumably led to a bedroom. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust except for the area immediately around the fireplace, where the floor had been recently swept clean. And there, arranged in a careful line on the mantel above the fire, were 5 cell phones. Christopher recognized Rachel's immediately, the purple case with the crack in the corner from when she'd dropped it last summer. Next to it was a phone in a pink case that probably belonged to Sarah. The other 3 were unfamiliar. His daughter's phone was here, but his daughter wasn't. "Rachel!" He moved through the cabin quickly, checking the bedroom, the small bathroom, a closet. Empty. All empty. But someone had been here recently. The fire was too fresh, the swept floor too clean, and those phones on the mantel arranged so deliberately like trophies. He picked up Rachel's phone. The screen was shattered, but when he pressed the power button, it flickered to life. 3% battery. The lock screen showed 17 missed calls, all from him. He tried to unlock it with Rachel's usual passcode, but it didn't work. He tried again, denied. A sound from outside made him freeze. Footsteps in the snow, slow, heavy, approaching the cabin. Christopher set down the phone and raised the shotgun, his heart hammering. The footsteps came closer, stopped just outside the door. "Rachel?" he called out, knowing somehow that it wasn't her. The breathing started then, that same wet, rattling sound he'd heard on the phone. Long, slow inhalations that seemed to go on forever, followed by exhales that sounded like wind through a cave. And beneath the breathing, a voice. Not words exactly, but something that might have been words once. before whatever was making them had forgotten how language worked. The door began to open. Christopher raised the shotgun to his shoulder, finger on the trigger. The door swung wider and a figure stepped into the firelight. It was a man. Or it had been. He was tall, skeletal thin despite wearing heavy winter clothing. His face was wrong. The proportions distorted, the cheekbones too high, the jaw too long. His eyes caught the firelight and reflected it back in shades of yellow and green, like an animal's. And his mouth, when it opened, revealed teeth that were too many and too sharp. "Where's my daughter?" Christopher demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. The thing that had been a man tilted its head at an angle that seemed anatomically impossible. When it spoke, the voice was a rasping whisper overlaid with something else, something hungry. "Your daughter? She called you. We heard her call. We were curious. Where is she? Where all the hungry children go. Where all the lost ones end up when winter comes and the food runs out." The creature took a step closer. "You should not have come here. This is our place, our hunting ground. The old ones gave it to us back when the world was young and the first winter came and men learned what hunger truly meant." Christopher fired the shotgun. The blast was deafening in the small cabin, and the creature staggered backward, a hole torn in its chest. But it didn't fall. It didn't die. Instead, it looked down at the wound almost curiously, and Christopher watched in horror as the torn flesh began to knit itself back together, pulling closed like a zipper. "Iron and powder," the creature rasped. "That does not work anymore. Nothing works anymore. We have eaten too much, grown too strong. The hunger never stops. The more we consume, the larger we become, and the larger we become, the more we must consume. Do you understand? There is no satisfaction. There is no end." It lunged forward with impossible speed. Christopher dove to the side, the creature's clawed hands missing him by inches. He rolled, came up running, and burst out the cabin door into the freezing night. Behind him, the creature let out a sound that might have been laughter or might have been a howl. Christopher ran toward the tree line, the snow dragging at his boots, his breath coming in ragged gasps that burned his lungs. Don't try to understand it. Don't try to fight it. Just run. He crashed through the trees, branches whipping at his face, and behind him, he could hear the creature following, moving through the snow with unnatural ease. Christopher risked a glance back and saw it loping along on all fours now, its body contorting into something that should not be able to move like that, should not be able to exist. The radio was in his pocket. He pulled it out as he ran, nearly dropping it with his gloved hands. "Dutch! Dutch, come in!" Static then. "I read you. What's happening? Get the plane ready to go now. What did you—" Something slammed into Christopher from the side, sending him sprawling into the snow. The creature was on top of him in an instant, its breath hot and fetid against his face, its hands, if they could still be called hands, pinning his shoulders to the ground. Up close, Christopher could see that its skin was gray and mottled, stretched too tight over bones that had grown too large. Its eyes were filmed over with white, but he knew it could see him perfectly. "Where is my daughter?" he managed to gasp out. "Your daughter," the creature whispered, "is becoming like us. She consumed the flesh. Not much, just a taste, when the hunger became too strong. But a taste is all it takes. The hunger enters you, and it never leaves. It grows and grows until you are nothing but appetite, nothing but need. She fights it now, but soon she will understand. Soon she will embrace it." No, that's not. Rachel would never. The others fought too. The girl's parents, the couple from last month, the 3 hikers from before that. The creature gestured with one elongated hand toward the cabin. "Their phones. We kept them. We like to hear them ring, to hear the voices of the ones who call, searching for those who are already lost. It reminds us of what we were, before the hunger took everything." "Where is she?" The creature's mouth stretched into something that might have been a smile. "Close hunting. We hunt together now. We are pack, we are family. And soon, you will join us. We will." The gunshot came from somewhere to Christopher's left, the sound flat and sharp in the frozen air. The creature's head snapped back, a dark spray of blood spattering across the snow. It fell backward off Christopher, thrashing in the drifts. "Get up!" a voice shouted. "Move!" Christopher scrambled to his feet and saw a figure running toward him through the trees, a woman mid-20s holding a rifle. Behind her came another figure, smaller, moving more slowly. "Run!" the woman shouted again. "It won't stay down long." Christopher ran toward her, and as they passed each other, he got a glimpse of her face, gaunt, hollow-eyed, with a desperate intensity that spoke of too many days without sleep, too many nights spent afraid. They came together near a fallen log, and that's when Christopher saw the second figure clearly. It was Rachel. If you're feeling chills right now, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Christopher's place? His daughter stood 20 feet away, partially hidden behind a tree, and Christopher's heart broke at the sight of her. She'd lost weight, too much weight in too short a time. Her eyes were sunken, her cheeks hollow. But worse than the physical changes was the look on her face, a mixture of recognition and hunger that made her seem like a stranger. "Rachel," he said, taking a step toward her. "Don't." The woman grabbed his arm. "Don't get too close. She's fighting it, but she's not strong enough yet. If you get too close, if she loses control." What happened to her? The same thing that happened to me, almost. The same thing that happened to everyone who's been on this island too long. The woman's eyes were wet with tears. "I'm Sarah Mitchum, and that thing you just met, that was my father." Christopher stared at her. "Your father?" 3 years ago, my parents bought this cabin. They loved it out here, loved the isolation. They'd come out for weeks at a time, even in winter. And then last month I got a call from my mom. She was hysterical. Said my dad had gotten lost in a storm, had been gone for 3 days. When he came back, he was different. She thought it was hypothermia, exposure. But it was worse than that. Behind them, the creature, Sarah's father, was stirring in the snow, that impossible vitality already knitting it back together. "By the time I got here," Sarah continued, speaking quickly, "my dad had already killed my mom. He'd eaten..." Her voice broke. "He'd eaten part of her. And he tried to get me to do the same. Said the hunger would make sense eventually, that I'd understand. I ran. Hid in the woods. Survived on what I could find. And then Rachel and her friend showed up." "Where's Rachel's friend?" Christopher asked, though he already knew the answer. Sarah's expression confirmed it. "Megan. She didn't last the first night. The hunger takes some people faster than others. Rachel's stronger. She's been fighting it for 3 days, but it's winning. There has to be a way to cure her. There has to be something. There's one way." Sarah raised the rifle, pointed it at Rachel. "Before she transforms completely, before she loses herself to the hunger, it's the only mercy left." "No." Christopher stepped between the rifle and his daughter. "I didn't come all this way to watch her die. There has to be another option." Sarah's father was on his feet now, moving toward them with that horrible loping gait. And from the trees on the other side came more figures, 3 of them at different stages of transformation. The Wendigo did hunt in packs. The Ojibwe had rituals, Sarah said desperately. Ways to fight the spirit before it took hold, but those are lost. No one knows them anymore. And even if we did, we don't have time. Look at her, Christopher. Really look at her. He did. Rachel was staring at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Love and hunger mixed together, her father's daughter and something else entirely. Her hands were clenched at her sides, fingernails digging into her palms hard enough to draw blood. She was trembling, every muscle locked in a fight against something inside her. "Dad," she managed to whisper. "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so hungry. I don't want to hurt you, but I'm so hungry and you smell like..." "It's okay, sweetheart. It's okay." Christopher moved toward her slowly. "Don't!" Sarah screamed. But Christopher kept walking, shotgun forgotten in the snow behind him. He approached his daughter the way he'd approached her when she was small and frightened by nightmares, with calm certainty and love. The creatures circling them stopped, watching with curious intensity. "Rachel," he said softly, "I know you're scared. I know something terrible is happening to you. But you're stronger than this. You've always been stronger than you knew." "I ate her, Dad." Rachel's voice was breaking. "Megan was my friend, and when she died I was so hungry and I couldn't stop myself. And now I can't stop thinking about it. About the taste. About how much I want more. I know. But you're still you. You're still my daughter. And we're going to get through this." He was close enough to touch her now. Rachel's eyes were wild, her whole body shaking. "You should run. You should let Sarah shoot me before I—" Christopher pulled her into a hug. For a moment, Rachel went rigid in his arms. He could feel her heart hammering, feel the terrible tension in her body as the hunger and her humanity fought for control. The creatures around them moved closer, drawn by the potential violence. Sarah raised her rifle but didn't fire. And then Rachel's arms came up around her father and she began to sob. "I don't want to die," she whispered into his shoulder. "I don't want to become like them. Dad, please, please help me." "I will, I promise." Sarah's father spoke from the darkness, his voice a papery rasp. Touching, but pointless. The hunger always wins. It has won for 1,000 years, every winter, every time men are pushed too far. You cannot fight it with love. You cannot fight it at all. "Then we won't fight it," Christopher said, his mind racing. He looked at Sarah. "The phones in the cabin, they still work?" "Some of them. Why?" "The Ojibwe rituals you mentioned. They're not lost. They're just not here. But information is everywhere now. If we can get a signal. There's no cell service on the island in winter. But there's satellite internet. The Park Service has stations. If we can get to one. The nearest one is 3 miles south, through the woods. At night, with them hunting us." Sarah gestured at the creatures. "We'd never make it. We have to try." The creature that had been Sarah's father laughed, that horrible wet rattle. "Yes, try. Run. Make the hunt interesting. It has been so long since we had prey that fought back." Christopher looked at Rachel, saw the desperate hope in her eyes. "Can you run?" "I think so. If you help me, Sarah." The young woman lowered her rifle, her expression hardening with determination. "Lead the way." They ran. Christopher supported Rachel on one side, Sarah on the other, and they crashed through the forest as fast as the deep snow would allow. Behind them, the creatures followed, but not at their full speed. They were playing, Christopher realized, enjoying the chase, drawing it out. The radio crackled in his pocket. "Christopher, what the hell is happening out there? I heard shots." He pulled out the radio without stopping. "Dutch, can you take off without us?" "What? No, I'm not leaving without—" "Listen to me. If we're not back in 30 minutes, take off. Get to the mainland and send help. Real help. Tell them—" He paused, gasping for breath. "Tell them to bring fire. And tell them not to come alone." "Christopher." 30 minutes. They ran in silence after that, conserving breath. The forest pressed in around them, every shadow potentially holding one of the creatures. Christopher's legs burned, his lungs ached from the cold air, but he kept moving. Rachel was struggling, her transformed metabolism burning through energy faster than a normal human's, leaving her weak and shaking. "How much farther?" he asked Sarah. 2 miles, maybe less. Something moved in the trees to their left. Christopher caught a glimpse of elongated limbs, eyes that reflected the moonlight. The creatures were getting closer, tightening the circle. They burst into a clearing, and there, half buried in snow, was a small metal building with a satellite dish on the roof. The Park Service station. Christopher tried the door. Locked. "Stand back," Sarah said, raising her rifle. She fired 3 times, destroying the lock mechanism. The door swung open to reveal a small room filled with emergency supplies and communication equipment. Christopher practically carried Rachel inside, and Sarah followed, slamming the door behind them and throwing the deadbolt. Immediately, something heavy slammed into the door from outside. The creatures had caught up. Christopher ignored them and went straight to the computer terminal. It powered on with agonizing slowness, the ancient machine taking its time to boot up. Outside, more impacts against the door and walls. Wood began to splinter. "Hurry," Sarah said, bracing her back against the door. The computer finally loaded. Christopher opened the browser and started searching. Ojibwe rituals, Wendigo, spiritual transformation, anything. The first 3 sites were useless, academic papers and Wikipedia entries. The fourth was a forum for indigenous cultural preservation. And there, buried in a thread about traditional medicine, he found it. A post from an Ojibwe elder describing a purification ritual for someone suffering from Wendigo psychosis. It involved specific herbs, a fire, a chant in Anishinaabe that had been passed down through generations. The post was from 2007. "I found something!" Christopher started reading, his eyes racing over the text. Rachel had collapsed in a corner, her eyes starting to film over with white. They were running out of time. The ritual required cedar, sage, and sweetgrass. Christopher searched the storage closet and found a first aid kit, emergency rations, and, miraculously, a small bundle of dried herbs labeled Traditional Medicine Donation, Keweenaw Bay Indian Community. It was enough. It had to be enough. "Sarah, I need you to keep them out for 5 more minutes." "Just 5? She laughed, slightly hysterical. "Make it 3. I don't think this door will last longer than that." Christopher cleared a space on the floor and began arranging the herbs according to the instructions he'd found. He pulled out a lighter, thank God he'd thought to bring one, and lit the small pile. Smoke began to rise, pungent and sharp. The chant was phonetically spelled out in the forum post. Christopher had no idea if his pronunciation would be anywhere close to correct, but he had to try. He knelt next to Rachel and began to speak the words, ancient syllables that felt strange and powerful in his mouth. The effect was immediate. Rachel's eyes snapped into focus and she screamed, a sound of pure agony. The creatures outside went silent. The smoke from the herbs seemed to intensify, filling the small building, and Christopher kept chanting, following the rhythm laid out in the post. Outside, one of the creatures began to wail, a sound of loss and rage that made Christopher's teeth ache. Another joined it, and another, until the night was filled with their howling. Christopher reached the end of the chant and repeated it, pouring every ounce of will and love and desperation into the words. Rachel convulsed, her back arching, her mouth open in a silent scream. And then suddenly, she went still. For a terrible moment, Christopher thought she was dead. Then her eyes opened. Normal eyes, brown and human and filled with tears. "Dad?" He pulled her into his arms, and this time, when she hugged him back, there was no hunger in it. Just relief and exhaustion and love. The creatures outside had gone silent. When Sarah cautiously opened the door a crack, they saw nothing but empty forest. The Wendigo had retreated, their hunt denied. They made it back to the plane as dawn was breaking. Dutch had the engine running, and he didn't ask questions as they climbed aboard. Sarah came with them, leaving the island and the nightmare of her parents behind. As they lifted off and Isle Royale fell away beneath them, Christopher held his daughter close and watched the sun rise over Lake Superior. In the daylight, the island looked peaceful, pristine, beautiful. You couldn't see the horror that lived there. You couldn't see the hunger that waited in the trees. But Christopher knew it was there. And he knew that the ritual had only freed Rachel from the Wendigo's grip. It hadn't destroyed the creatures themselves. They were still there, still hunting, still hungry. And they always would be, as long as winter came and the forest remained. Rachel stirred against his shoulder. "Dad?" "Yeah? Thank you for not giving up on me." "Never," he said. Not ever. 3 months later, Christopher learned that Isle Royale National Park had been closed indefinitely due to wildlife concerns. The official statement mentioned unusual wolf behavior and a temporary ban on all visitors until further notice. Sarah's parents were listed as missing, presumed dead in a hiking accident. The other missing persons were never mentioned at all. Christopher knew better. The Park Service knew something was wrong, even if they didn't fully understand what. Maybe that was for the best. Some things couldn't be fought with conventional means. Some horrors were too old, too deeply rooted in the primitive fears of humanity. Rachel went back to school, saw a therapist, tried to rebuild her life. She never spoke about what happened on the island except for one night when Christopher found her standing at her bedroom window, staring out at the darkness. "I can still feel it sometimes," she said quietly. "Not the hunger. That's gone. But the memory of it, the knowledge of what I'm capable of when pushed far enough. It never really leaves you, does it? That understanding of how thin the line is between human and monster." Christopher put his arm around her shoulders. "No. But the fact that you fight it, that you choose not to cross that line, that's what makes you human. Not the absence of darkness, but the choice to walk toward the light despite it." She leaned against him and they stood together in silence, father and daughter, survivors of something that shouldn't exist but did. Outside, the world continued on, oblivious to the horrors that lurked in isolated places, the ancient hungers that waited in the cold and the dark. And Christopher was content to let it stay that way. Some knowledge was too dangerous to spread. Some truths were better left buried in the snow. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? Christopher Henley had been a ranger at Superior National Forest for 19 years, and in all that time, he'd developed an almost religious faith in patterns. People got lost because they panicked, not because the wilderness was inherently malicious. They died from exposure because they'd ignored weather forecasts, not because something was hunting them. The forest was dangerous, certainly, but it was a quantifiable danger. Hypothermia at certain temperatures, dehydration after specific time frames, wildlife encounters that followed predictable behavioral models. So when Lauren Mitchell's emergency beacon activated at 3:47 a.m. on February 12, 2011, Christopher approached it the way he approached everything, methodically, rationally, with a thermos of black coffee and a laminated checklist in his coat pocket. The temperature had dropped to minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, with wind chill pushing it closer to minus 30. Lauren, a wildlife photographer from Madison, had been granted a special winter permit to document the recovery of the gray wolf population in the Boundary Waters. She'd checked in via satellite phone every evening at 6 p.m. for the past 4 days. Professional, prepared, exactly the kind of permit holder Christopher appreciated. The beacon coordinates placed her approximately 11 miles northeast of his station, deep in a section of old-growth forest that bordered the Canadian wilderness. Christopher radioed the regional office in Duluth, logged his departure at 4:23 a.m., and headed out on his snowmobile with enough emergency supplies for 2 people to last 72 hours. The forest before dawn was a study in absolutes. Black trees against white snow. Silence so complete, it had texture. Christopher's headlight cut through the darkness like a surgical instrument, revealing the landscape in stark factual detail. Frozen lakes, snow-laden pines, the occasional eye shine of a deer or fox observing his passage. He reached the beacon coordinates at 6:15 a.m., just as the eastern sky began its reluctant transition from black to gray. Lauren's campsite sat in a small clearing beside Moose Lake, and Christopher's first thought was that it looked almost theatrical in its wrongness. The tent remained standing, but its entrance gaped open, the zipper peeled back from the inside. Lauren's sleeping bag lay half extracted, one corner frozen to the ground in a puddle of ice that suggested spilled water, or maybe something else. Her photography equipment sat arranged on a tarp with unsettling precision. 3 camera bodies, 5 lenses, all perfectly aligned as if arranged for an exhibition. The camp stove stood upright, cold, with a pot of what looked like freeze-dried stew abandoned mid-preparation. Christopher killed his snowmobile engine and stood in the sudden silence, cataloging details with the same methodical attention he'd bring to any rescue scenario. Boot prints led from the tent toward the tree line. Lauren's, based on the size and tread pattern matching her permit application photos. But the stride length troubled him. They were spaced too far apart, suggesting a run, but the depth was inconsistent. Some prints pressed deep into the snow, others barely disturbed the surface, as if she'd been leaping rather than running. He followed them into the forest, his radio crackling with static as the trees closed overhead. "Base, this is Henley. I'm at the coordinates. Campsite abandoned. Tracks heading north-northeast into heavy timber. Appears to be a rapid departure. Possible panic response. Beginning track and follow." The dispatcher's voice fragmented through interference. "Copy. Henley. Weather. Ting worse. Front moving. 12 hours. Understood. I'll have her back before then." He wouldn't, but Christopher didn't know that yet. The tracks led him deeper into sections of forest he'd rarely visited even in his 19 years. The boundary waters contained over 1 million acres, and this particular region had a reputation among the Ojibwe guides who occasionally worked with the Forest Service. They called it Windigo Aki, Wendigo country. Christopher had always dismissed such talk as cultural folklore, the kind of stories that grew naturally in isolated communities, useful for keeping inexperienced hikers away from genuinely dangerous terrain, but nothing more. After 40 minutes of tracking, the boot prints simply stopped. Not gradually, not scattered or confused or showing signs of Lauren doubling back. They just ended, mid-stride, in the center of a small clearing ringed by ancient white pines. Christopher stood at the final print, staring at unmarked snow that extended for 50 feet in every direction. The rational part of his mind immediately began constructing explanations. She'd stepped on a log, jumped to harder ground, backtracked in her own footprints. But when he examined the area more carefully, these explanations crumbled. No logs, no rocks, no hard-packed snow that would fail to take an impression. Just the crystalline, undisturbed surface glittering in the strengthening daylight. And then he saw the trees, 5 white pines arranged in a rough circle around the clearing, each bearing marks about 7 feet up their trunks. Christopher approached the nearest one, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The bark had been stripped away in long, vertical gouges, 4 parallel lines, each about an inch apart. The exposed wood beneath was fresh, sap frozen in amber teardrops. Claw marks, his mind supplied automatically, but no bear would climb to that height in February, mid-hibernation. And the spacing was wrong, too wide, too uniform. He took off his glove and touched the gouges, feeling the roughness where something had torn through living wood with enough force to leave splinters. His satellite phone worked better than the radio in these conditions. He pulled it out, photographed the marks, the footprints, the clearing. Then he expanded his search pattern, moving in concentric circles outward from Lauren's last known position. 20 yards north, he found the first anomaly. A deer carcass lay sprawled across a fallen log, and Christopher's stomach clenched at the sight of it. The animal had been opened. That was the only word that fit. Its ribcage splayed wide, organs gone, and the meat of its haunches torn away in ragged strips. But there was almost no blood in the snow, just a few dark spots that looked more like punctuation marks than evidence of the massacre before him. What disturbed Christopher most was the cold. The carcass should have been frozen solid in these temperatures, but when he cautiously touched the deer's flank with his boot, he felt pliability, warmth, as if it had been killed within the last hour. He photographed it, made notes, and continued his search. The second anomaly appeared 50 yards east, a circle of footprints in the snow, all pointing inward toward a center point where the snow had been compressed and darkened. Not Lauren's boots. These were bare feet, but impossibly large. Christopher knelt and measured one with his hand span. 14 inches long with toe impressions that seemed too elongated, too sharp at the tips. His radio crackled to life, making him jump. "Henley. Report. Status." The situation is developing," he said, hearing the inadequacy of his own words. "Possible animal attack. Unusual tracks. I need to expand the search radius before the weather moves in." "Copy. Backup. Available. Storm." The static swallowed the rest. Christopher stood alone in the clearing, surrounded by impossible evidence that his rational mind kept trying to process and failing. Bare footprints in -18-degree weather. A deer killed and consumed so recently, its flesh remained warm. Claw marks 7 feet up tree trunks. And somewhere in this frozen wilderness, Lauren Mitchell, who should have been in her tent drinking coffee and reviewing yesterday's photographs. He found her first camera 3 hours later. It lay in the snow beside a frozen creek, lens cap missing, the viewfinder cracked. Christopher's hands shook. From cold, he told himself, just from cold, as he powered it on. The battery indicator showed 40% charge. The last image timestamp read 3:31 a.m., 16 minutes before Lauren's emergency beacon activated. Christopher clicked through the final photographs, his breath catching as the sequence unfolded. 2:15 a.m. A selfie of Lauren in her tent grinning at the camera, holding up a pack of hot chocolate. Caption in her photo notes, "Living my best winter camping life." 3:18 a.m. The tent's open entrance, darkness beyond. The note read, "Heard something outside. Checking." 3:22 a.m. Trees, just trees, illuminated by camera flash, trunks pale against darkness. 3:24 a.m. A shape between the trees, blurred, too tall to be human, moving too fast for the shutter speed to fully capture. Lauren's note, "What the fuck?" 3:27 a.m. Close-up of tracks in the snow, the same bare footprints Christopher had found, but these were fresh in the image, crisp and deep. No note. 3:29 a.m. Nothing but white. The flash had overexposed, or she'd pointed the camera at snow, or 3:31 a.m. The final image. Christopher almost dropped the camera. The photograph showed Lauren's own face, but the angle was wrong, too high, as if someone very tall had lifted the camera above her head and pointed it downward. Her expression was pure terror, mouth open mid-scream, eyes wide and reflecting the camera flash. But behind her, barely visible in the darkness beyond the flash's reach, something else was captured. A figure, impossibly thin and impossibly tall, with limbs that bent at joints where joints shouldn't be, and its mouth was open, so wide that it seemed to split its entire face, filled with teeth that looked like broken ice. Christopher's hands stopped shaking. A strange calm descended, the kind he'd read about in trauma literature, the moment when the mind simply accepts that it cannot process what it's experiencing and defaults to autopilot. He saved the images to the camera's internal memory, then to his phone, then turned off the camera and secured it in his pack with the methodical care of someone following a protocol that no longer applied. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. The western sky showed the first gray smudges of the approaching storm front. Christopher had maybe 6 hours before conditions became unsurvivable, even with his shelter training and equipment. He should turn back. Every survival protocol, every regulation, every ounce of his 19 years of experience screamed that he should return to base, call in a full search and rescue team, wait for better conditions. Instead, he continued north. The tracks appeared again a half-mile from where he'd found the camera. Not Lauren's boots now, but those impossible bare footprints, each one perfectly preserved in the frozen snow. They no longer wandered or circled. They moved with purpose, with direction, leading him deeper into Wiindiguaki. Christopher followed them as daylight peaked and began its early winter decline. He followed them as the first snow began falling, soft and silent. He followed them as his satellite phone lost signal, and his radio became nothing but white noise. He followed them because somewhere in his rational, methodical mind, a new understanding had formed. The wilderness wasn't inherently malicious, but it wasn't inherently benign either, and some patterns, once recognized, couldn't be ignored. The trees changed. Christopher noticed it gradually. The way they leaned away from the path. The way their branches seemed to recoil, creating a corridor through the forest that felt less like natural growth and more like avoidance. The snow here lay strangely undisturbed despite the wind that had picked up, as if even the weather refused to fully enter this space. Then he smelled it. The odor came in waves, carried on the wind, rot and copper, and something sweetly putrid that made his throat constrict. It was the smell of a meat freezer after a power outage, of roadkill left too long in summer heat, except this was happening in sub-zero temperatures where decay shouldn't be possible. The footprints led to a ravine. Christopher approached the edge carefully, his headlamp cutting through the gathering darkness. The ravine dropped maybe 30 feet, its bottom choked with fallen trees and drifted snow. And at the far end, partially hidden by an overhang of rock and ice, he saw a structure. Not a cave exactly, more like a lair. Bones formed its outer architecture, arranged with terrible deliberation. Deer ribs forming arches, skulls marking corners, leg bones lashed together with what looked like strips of hide. And there, just visible in the shadows, a splash of bright red that could only be a human jacket. Lauren's jacket. "Lauren!" Christopher's voice cracked through the frozen air. "Lauren Mitchell, can you hear me?" Nothing. Just the wind and the settling snow and that overwhelming stench of decay. He found a game trail that switched back down into the ravine, using his trekking poles to navigate the treacherous descent. His headlamp beam bounced with each step, creating a disorienting strobe effect across the bone structure ahead. The jacket lay crumpled just inside the entrance, frozen solid. When Christopher picked it up, he found it empty. No body, no blood, just the jacket itself, discarded like shed skin. He searched the immediate area, his light revealing details that made his methodical mind stutter and fail. More bones, these arranged in patterns that seemed significant but remained incomprehensible. Symbols carved into the rock face, spiral designs, radiating lines, shapes that hurt to look at directly, and scattered among the bones fragments of other lives. A 1990s-era hiking boot, a rotted backpack, a tarnished wedding ring attached to a finger bone so small it could only belong to a child. This wasn't a killing site. This was a gallery, a collection. The sound started as a whisper, wind through trees maybe, or ice cracking in the cold. But it grew, ascending in pitch and volume until Christopher recognized it as something alive, something breathing. The sound came from deeper in the ravine, from the darkness beyond his headlamp's reach. Then the breathing became words. "Hungry," the voice said, except it wasn't speaking English. And Christopher shouldn't have understood it, but he did. So hungry, always hungry, never full, never satisfied, never enough. Christopher's finger found his radio's emergency button and held it down, sending out a continuous distress signal that would hopefully penetrate the static. Then he drew his service weapon, a .40 caliber Glock that suddenly felt absurdly inadequate, and backed slowly toward the ravine wall. "Lauren," he called again, hearing the tremor in his voice. "If you can hear me, if you can move, we need to leave. Now." The thing that emerged from the shadows made Christopher understand why the Ojibwe had named this place Windigu Aki. It had been human once. He could see remnants of that humanity in its basic structure. The suggestion of a face, the memory of limbs. But something had gone terribly wrong with the proportions. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its body elongated as if stretched on a rack, ribs visible through translucent skin that had a grayish frostbitten hue, its limbs bent at wrong angles, joints reversed or multiplied, ending in hands that had too many fingers, each tipped with a blackened claw. But the worst part was its face. The jaw had dislocated or broken, allowing the mouth to gape impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth that looked like they'd been filed to points. The eyes, God, the eyes, were yellow and mad with hunger, locked onto Christopher with an intensity that communicated only one thing: prey. "Hungry," it said again, and Christopher realized with horror that the voice was coming from Lauren, or what had been Lauren. Her jacket, her build visible beneath the grotesque transformation, her camping permit still attached to a belt loop on jeans that now hung on a skeletal frame. The Wendigo myths were real. The cultural warnings weren't folklore, and Lauren Mitchell had violated some ancient taboo, consumed something she shouldn't have, crossed some boundary that couldn't be uncrossed, and the hunger had taken her. Christopher fired 3 shots, center mass, just as he'd trained. The reports echoed through the ravine like thunder. The thing wearing Lauren Mitchell's skin didn't even flinch. It lunged forward with speed that defied its size, covering 30 feet in a single bound. Christopher threw himself sideways, hitting the frozen ground hard enough to crack a rib. His headlamp fell, spinning across the snow, casting crazy shadows that turned the ravine into a nightmare carousel. He scrambled for his snowmobile, parked at the ravine's edge above. His radio was screaming static. His phone showed no signal. The storm had arrived early, snow falling so heavily it erased the world beyond a few feet of visibility. The Wendigo pursued him with patience, not rushing now, just following. Stalking. Christopher could hear it breathing, hear its joints clicking and popping with each movement, hear the soft whisper of its voice. Hungry, 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 never full, never enough. He made it to the snowmobile, fumbled with the ignition, felt the engine roar to life. The headlight cut through the storm, illuminating his path back toward civilization, toward rationality, toward a world where this couldn't be real. Then Lauren's face appeared in the light, inches from the snowmobile's windscreen, and Christopher saw recognition flicker in those yellow eyes, a moment of horrible clarity when something human still remained inside that twisted form. "Help me," she whispered, and her jaw cracked wider. "So hungry. Please, make it stop." Christopher gunned the engine, jerking away so violently he nearly tipped the machine. He didn't look back. Couldn't look back. The snowmobile roared through the forest, branches whipping past, snow blinding him, the wind carrying that voice behind him. Hungry, hungry, hungry. He rode for hours through the whiteout storm, following instinct and desperation rather than navigation. When he finally saw the lights of his ranger station through the snow, he almost wept with relief. The other rangers found him collapsed beside his snowmobile, hypothermic and delirious, murmuring about hunger and teeth and things that shouldn't exist. They got him inside, warmed him up, listened to his story with expressions that mixed concern and skepticism. The search team deployed the next morning, found Lauren Mitchell's campsite exactly as Christopher had described. They found the abandoned tent, the arranged camera equipment, the boot prints leading into the forest. They even found the deer carcass, though it was frozen solid by then, its wounds attributed to scavenger activity. They found the camera with its saved photographs, but the final image, the one showing Lauren's terrified face and the thing behind her, was corrupted, showing only static and artifacts. Technical malfunction, the investigation report concluded. Sensor failure due to extreme cold. They never found the ravine. Christopher led 3 separate expeditions to the coordinates he'd logged, but the landscape refused to cooperate. The GPS readings placed them in the right location, but the ravine simply wasn't there. Just unbroken forest, pristine snow, trees that grew in patterns that suggested nothing had ever disturbed them. Lauren Mitchell was declared lost to exposure, her body likely consumed by wildlife or buried under snowfall. Her family held a memorial service in Madison. Her photography received a posthumous award from National Geographic. Christopher Henley returned to work after a mandatory psychological evaluation and a month of administrative leave. He resumed his duties with the same methodical attention to detail, the same rational approach to wilderness management. But he no longer works alone in winter. He refuses permits for solo camping in the northeastern sections of Superior National Forest, and sometimes on the coldest nights when the temperature drops below -20 and the wind howls through the pines, he stands at his station window and watches the tree line. Because patterns are everything, and Christopher has recognized a new one. Every winter since 2011, at least one experienced hiker goes missing in the Boundary Waters. Always in February, always in the northeastern quadrant, always after camping alone, and sometimes in the weeks following these disappearances, other hikers report strange encounters. A figure glimpsed between trees, impossibly tall and impossibly thin, moving with wrong-jointed grace through the frozen forest. They report hearing voices in the wind, always saying the same thing: hungry, hungry, hungry. The Ojibwe guides know what it means. They've known for centuries. The Wendigo doesn't die. It only spreads a contagion of hunger, a curse that transforms the desperate and the isolated into something that can never be satisfied. Christopher has started keeping a private log, mapping the disappearances, tracking the pattern. 19 people in 12 years, all matching similar profiles, all last seen in terrain that the locals call Wendigo Aki. He should report his suspicions to someone. The Forest Service. the FBI, someone who might listen to a decorated ranger with 19 years of exemplary service. Instead, he stays quiet and watches the forests through his window, waiting for winter to end, knowing it never really does. Not here, not in the boundary waters, where the hunger walks on two legs and wears human faces and speaks in voices that sound almost like cries for help. Last week, a new permit application crossed his desk. Solo winter camping, wildlife photography, same quadrant where Lauren disappeared. Christopher denied it with a stamp and a form letter about unsafe conditions. But he knows someone will approve it eventually. Someone always does. Because people have faith in patterns, in their ability to survive, in the fundamental rationality of the natural world. Christopher had that faith once. Now he just has his logs, his maps, and the certain knowledge that somewhere in the frozen darkness of Superior National Forest, something that used to be Lauren Mitchell is still hungry, still hunting, still spreading the curse that transformed her from photographer to predator. And on the coldest nights when his windows frost over and the temperature drops low enough to kill an unprotected human in hours, Christopher thinks he can hear her voice in the wind, calling his name, inviting him back to Windiguaki, promising that this time, he won't escape. The hunger is patient, the hunger is eternal, and the hunger is always, always waiting. Hope this story gave you genuine chills. If you felt real terror reading this, consider following for more authentic supernatural horror. Which moment disturbed you most? The transformed Lauren? The bone gallery? The corrupted photograph? Share your thoughts below. The rain had been falling for 6 days straight when Brandon Mitchell found the first evidence that Rachel Hayes had never made it back from the Hoh River Trail. It wasn't unusual for researchers to extend their fieldwork in Olympic National Park. The temperate rainforest had a way of swallowing time along with sunlight. But Rachel had missed 2 scheduled radio check-ins, and that wasn't like her. She was methodical, almost obsessive about protocol. Brandon knew this because they'd worked together for 3 years, cataloging the biodiversity of one of the most primordial forests left in the lower 48 states. He'd volunteered to hike out to her last known coordinates, partly out of concern, partly because he needed to collect samples from the same area anyway. The Park Service had been reluctant to call it a search and rescue operation yet. It was September 2008, and they were understaffed, stretched thin by budget cuts. Give it another day, the ranger station had told him over the crackling radio. She's probably just hunkered down waiting out the storm. But Brandon had a feeling, the kind of intuitive dread that his scientific training taught him to ignore, but that had been gnawing at his gut since Rachel's first missed check-in. He packed his gear with the efficiency of someone who'd spent half his adult life in the backcountry. GPS unit, first aid kit, emergency beacon, water purification tablets, and his field journal. The temperature was dropping, unusual for early September, and he added an extra thermal layer. The trailhead was empty when he arrived at dawn, his truck the only vehicle in the muddy parking area. Fog clung to the Sitka spruces like cobwebs, and the air smelled of decay and growth in equal measure, the perpetual cycle of the rainforest. Brandon had always found comfort in that smell, the evidence of biological processes working exactly as they should, predictable and quantifiable. Today it made him uneasy in a way he couldn't articulate. The trail descended into shadow almost immediately. Olympic's old-growth forest was a cathedral of moss and time, with western red cedars and Douglas firs that had been standing when the Mayflower landed. The canopy was so dense that even at midday, the light was green and submarine. His boots squelched in the mud and ferns brushed against his waterproof pants, leaving trails of moisture. Everything dripped. Everything grew. The forest was alive in a way that felt almost conscious. Brandon had hiked 5 miles following the route Rachel had outlined in her research plan when he saw the first marker. She'd been studying spotted owl populations and had set up audio monitoring equipment at intervals along an old game trail. The recorder should have been there, mounted on a cedar trunk at eye level. Instead, he found it on the ground, 20 feet off the trail, the casing cracked open, and the internal components scattered in the moss. He knelt beside it, his scientist's mind immediately cataloging the damage. The plastic housing showed no teeth marks, no claw scratches, It hadn't been knocked down by a bear or cougar. The wiring had been pulled out deliberately, methodically, and arranged in a pattern around the device. Brandon's breath caught. The pattern was geometric, precise, 7 strands of wire forming a spiral with the recorder at the center. This was wrong. This was carefully done. But why would Rachel do this to her own equipment? He took photographs with his digital camera, making sure to capture the arrangement from multiple angles, then continued up the trail with a growing sense of wrongness that made his skin prickle. The temperature seemed to be dropping further, his breath now visible in small clouds. That shouldn't be possible. It was barely below 50 degrees. The second monitoring station was a quarter-mile ahead. He found it in a similar state. Recorder destroyed, components arranged in another spiral pattern. But this one had something else. Carved into the bark of the tree, fresh sap still weeping from the cuts, was a symbol Brandon didn't recognize. It looked like a face or perhaps a mask with empty circular eyes and a gaping mouth. Below it, someone had scratched words in what looked like hurried desperation. They see with borrowed eyes. Rachel's handwriting. He was sure of it. Brandon's pulse accelerated despite his attempts to remain calm. There had to be a rational explanation. Hypothermia could cause confusion, hallucinations. Maybe Rachel had gotten disoriented in the storm, damaged her equipment in her confusion. But the symbols, the precision of the wire arrangements, those suggested planning, intention. He pulled out his radio, but static was all that came back. The storm, probably, interfering with transmission. He marked his GPS location and pressed on. Rachel's camp should be another 2 miles ahead at the confluence where the Ho River met a smaller tributary. If she was anywhere, she'd be there. The forest changed as he hiked deeper. The moss grew thicker, covering not just the trees but the ground in a carpet of green that swallowed sound. His footsteps became eerily muted. The usual forest noises, bird song, the rustle of small animals, the whisper of wind through branches, had ceased entirely. Brandon had spent enough time in the wilderness to know that silence like this meant something was wrong. Prey animals went quiet when predators were near. But what predator could silence an entire forest? He found Rachel's tent in a small clearing near the water. The sight of it sent ice through his veins. The tent had been shredded, not torn. Shredded, as if something with multiple blades had systematically cut it into ribbons. Her gear was scattered across the clearing, and in the center, arranged with that same unsettling precision, was a circle of stones. No, not just stones. As Brandon approached, his boots heavy with dread, he saw that each stone had been painted with red ochre in the same mask-like face he'd seen carved in the tree. 7 stones, 7 faces, all staring inward at something in the center of the circle. In the middle lay Rachel's field journal, open to a page covered in her handwriting. The entries had devolved from neat scientific observations to increasingly frantic scrawls. Brandon picked it up with shaking hands and began to read. September 2nd, standard survey work. Recorded 3 spotted owls in Sector 7. Noticed unusual markings on trees. Possibly bear scratches, but pattern seems deliberate. We'll document tomorrow. September 3rd. Found more markings. They're not natural. Someone has been carving these symbols throughout this section of forest. The Ho tribe considers this area sacred, off limits. Am I trespassing on ceremonial grounds? The symbols look like faces, or masks. They watch me. September 4th. Heard singing last night. Not human, not owl. Something between. Checked my audio recordings, but they captured only static. The singing was clear, beautiful, terrible. It knew my name. My GPS coordinates don't match the map. I'm exactly where I should be, but the distances are wrong. The forest is bigger on the inside. September 5th. They came to my tent. I heard footsteps circling, never stopping. When I looked out, I saw figures, tall, wearing masks, or not masks. Their faces are masks, wooden and painted and moving. They didn't speak, but I understood. This is Tsiatko land. I have heard too much, seen too much. The forest doesn't want me to leave. September 6th. I am not alone in my skin anymore. Something is watching through my eyes. When I look at my hands, they don't feel like mine. The Tsiatko take pieces. They wear them. I found my equipment destroyed, arranged in their patterns. I don't remember doing it, but the blood under my nails says I did. Brandon, if you find this, don't look for me. Don't follow the singing. The forest is hungry and it feeds on curiosity. The Salish were right. Some places belong to the old ones, and we are nothing but children playing in their hunting grounds. The entry ended there. The next pages had been torn out. Brandon's scientific mind reeled, trying to find purchase on rationality. Hallucinations, drugs, some kind of psychotic break. But the evidence was physical, real, documented, and he could feel it now, that sensation of being watched. The clearing felt smaller than it should, the trees leaning in, and the silence was so complete it hurt his ears. Then he heard it, singing. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a voice that might have been human once but had forgotten how. The melody was complex, beautiful in a way that made his chest ache, and underneath it was something that sounded like cedar wood creaking, like stone grinding on stone. The words were in a language he didn't know but somehow understood on a level below thought. We are the walkers between. We are the masked ones. We take what wanders too deep. We wear what we find. Brandon stumbled backward, his boot catching on one of the painted stones. He fell, his hand plunging into the moss, and touched something hard. He pulled it free and wished immediately that he hadn't. It was a mask, carved from red cedar, painted with ochre and charcoal. The face was elongated, the eyes hollow circles, the mouth open in a scream or song, and it was wet with something dark and viscous that he knew, with horrible certainty, was blood. Fresh blood. "Rachel," he whispered, and his voice sounded small and useless in the vast silence of the forest. The singing grew louder. Brandon scrambled to his feet, stuffing Rachel's journal into his pack. He had to get out, had to report this, had to... A figure stood at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, impossibly tall, maybe 8 feet, dressed in cedar bark cloth that hung in strips like flesh. Its face was a mask, like the one he'd found but larger, more elaborate, with real human hair woven into the wood. The eyes were empty, but he felt them seeing him, seeing through him, seeing every thought in his head. Behind it, more figures emerged from between the trees. 3, 5, 7 of them, all wearing masks, all watching with eyes that weren't eyes. The Tsiatko. Brandon's training, his education, his entire worldview built on empiricism and evidence, shattered like glass. This was real. This was happening. The folklore wasn't metaphor or superstition, it was warning. He ran. The forest exploded with sound. The singing became shrieking, and beneath it was laughter that sounded like wood splitting. Brandon crashed through ferns and moss, his GPS unit forgotten, his emergency beacon useless. Branches grabbed at him like hands. The ground seemed to shift beneath his feet, distances contracting and expanding in ways that defied physics. He could hear them behind him, the Tsiatko moving through the forest with a strange shuffling gait, their feet making sounds like drums on hollow earth. They were hurting him, he realized, pushing him deeper, away from the trail, toward something. A ravine opened before him, sudden and impossible. He skidded to a stop at the edge, rocks tumbling into darkness. The singing surrounded him now, coming from all directions. The Tsiatko emerged from the trees in a circle, their masks gleaming with rain or blood or both. The tallest one, their leader perhaps, or their priest, raised its arms. In one hand it held another mask, smaller, more delicate, human-sized. Brandon's blood turned to ice as he recognized Rachel's features carved into the wood, her expression frozen in eternal terror. The Tsiatko spoke, and its voice was like wind through a graveyard. She walks with us now. She sings our songs. The forest accepts its tribute. No, Brandon said, his voice breaking. No, that's not. She was a person. She had a life. You can't just... All things return to the earth, the Tsiatko said. All things feed the old growth. You study the forest, scientist. You count the birds and catalog the moss. But you never understood what you were counting. This forest is older than your species. It remembers when the ice came. It remembers when the first people learned to fear the dark between the trees. We are its memory. We are its hunger. We are what happens when trespassers forget the old agreements. Another Tsiatko stepped forward, holding a mask that was blank, uncarved, waiting. For him. Brandon's mind fragmented. This wasn't possible. This violated every natural law. But the masks were real. The blood was real. Rachel's journal was in his pack. And he was going to die here. Going to become another carved face for them to wear. Unless his hand found the emergency flare in his jacket pocket. It was a pathetic weapon. A child's defense against gods and monsters. But it was all he had. He pulled the cap and ignited it. The red flame brilliant and alien in the green twilight of the forest. The Tsiatko recoiled, their masks tilting in what might have been surprise or curiosity. Fire, the oldest fear, the oldest weapon. Brandon threw the flare at the nearest figure and ran parallel to the ravine, looking for a way across, a way out. Anything. Behind him, the forest screamed. The Tsiatko shrieked in voices that weren't human, never had been human. But they were following. And he knew with cold certainty that his flare had only delayed the inevitable. He found a fallen log bridging the ravine and scrambled across, not looking down at the darkness below. The log was slick with moss and rain. Halfway across, his foot slipped. He caught himself clinging to the rough bark, splinters driving into his palms. Behind him, the Tsiatko had reached the log. They stood there, silhouetted against the dim forest light, their masks expressionless, but somehow conveying terrible hunger. Then the tallest one did something that stopped Brandon's heart. It removed its mask. Beneath was another face, human once maybe, but stretched and hollow, with eyes that were empty sockets and a mouth that opened too wide. It spoke in a voice that might have been Rachel's, might have been a dozen voices layered together. Brandon, don't you want to sing with us? Don't you want to be part of the forest forever? We're so beautiful here, we're so free. It wasn't Rachel. It was wearing her, using her voice like a borrowed coat. Something broke in Brandon then, some final wall between sanity and survival. He let go of the log and dropped into the ravine. The fall seemed to last forever. He hit water, the tributary running high and fast with rainwater. The current seized him, dragged him through darkness and chaos. His pack was ripped away. His GPS unit, his radio, his camera, all gone. He tumbled through water that was so cold it burned, unable to tell up from down, unable to breathe, unable to think beyond the single desperate need to survive. When he finally surfaced, coughing and gasping, he was in a wider part of the river, the current slower. He dragged himself onto a gravel bar, shaking so violently his teeth chattered. Night had fallen, or the forest had become darker, or he'd traveled to some place where the sun never reached. He couldn't tell. The singing had stopped. The forest was silent again, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of something waiting. Brandon lay on the gravel, his clothes soaked, his body hypothermic, his mind struggling to process what he'd seen. The rational part of him, the scientist, the man who'd spent his career studying ecosystem dynamics and population genetics, was gone. In its place was something more primitive, something that understood on a cellular level that he had trespassed against powers older than civilization. He must have blacked out. When he came to, it was dawn, gray and weak, but dawn. He was still on the gravel bar. His body ached in ways he didn't know were possible. But he was alive. It took him 6 hours to find his way back to the trailhead, following the river downstream, stumbling and falling, eating nothing, drinking only when he couldn't stand the thirst anymore. His truck was still there. The parking lot was still real. The world beyond the forest still existed. He drove to the ranger station, his hands shaking on the wheel. Tried to explain, tried to report. But the words came out wrong, disjointed. They thought he was in shock, which he was. They thought he'd gotten lost, which he had. They organized a search party for Rachel, which found nothing but her destroyed camp and her journal. which Brandon realized with horror he'd lost in the river. Without the journal, without the photographs on his camera, without any physical evidence, his story sounded like a hallucination. Exposure, hypothermia, stress. The official report would say that Rachel Hayes had likely fallen and died somewhere in the backcountry, her body carried away by flooding. That Brandon Mitchell had gotten disoriented searching for her and experienced a mental break induced by environmental stressors. He didn't argue. What could he say? That the forest was haunted by shamanic spirits who collected people like masks? That the old Salish warnings were literal truth? That there were places where rationality ended and something else began? Brandon never went back into Olympic National Park. He quit his job, moved to Seattle, took a position at a university where he taught ecology from the safety of a classroom. Sometimes he dreamed of the singing. Sometimes he woke with the certainty that he was being watched through eyes that weren't his own. And sometimes when the rain fell hard and the night was dark, he heard Rachel's voice calling his name from the shadows between trees, inviting him to come back, to join the forest, to be part of something ancient and terrible and hungry. He never answered. But he knew, with the part of him that had been broken in those woods, that someday he would. The Tsiatko were patient. The forest was eternal, and some trespasses could never be forgiven, only postponed. The masks were waiting. They were always waiting. If this story gave you chills, could you survive in Brandon's place? The forest remembers. The old ones are patient. And some places should never be explored no matter what science tells us.